Hey, hi, hello, how you doing? Today we are going to be talking about character motivation. So every character in every book has a reason for why they do what they do throughout the course of the story. They have a goal that they want to achieve and a reason behind why this goal is so important for them to achieve. And this motivation, especially the motivations of larger main characters in your story, will drive your whole plot forward. Which is why it is so incredibly important to be able to nail down each of your character's motivation correctly so that you can use it and manipulate it to tell your story in the way that you want. To give a simple definition, your character's motivation is the reason behind their actions, thought processes, and reasonings throughout the course of your story. Every single character has a motivation, from your protagonist, your narrator, your villain, every single side character, and even that one little character that we only see in one scene that comes to deliver the mail has a motivation. Each of these different motivations impact each other and influences the characters, their motivations, as well as how they go about their actions and thought processes throughout the story. To give some easy examples, let's say that all of your characters are stuck in the woods and they are trying to find a way back home before they run out of water and food. Their motivation is survival. Your main character's brother has been abducted by some unknown antagonist, and your protagonist's goal is to bring home his brother. Your character's motivation is to bring home their brother safe and sound. If your main character is running from the police after committing a crime, their motivation is to keep their freedom. Now, in some cases, the motivation is very clear, and in other cases, the motivation of your character will be harder to nail down, especially if this is a character that we don't see as often, or is a character that is supposed to be a lot more mysterious and a lot more vague, keeps a lot more secrets. Your character's motivation, including those small ones and the ones that you rack your brain on for hours on end, are incredibly important, and I'm gonna explain to you why. If you don't have a motivation, you don't have a story. We do everything that we do in our everyday life for a reason. We are always motivated by something. If we decide to go to bed a little bit earlier than normal, our motivation is to have enough energy in the morning. When we go to grab food, our motivation is that we are hungry and we don't want to be hungry anymore. If we go to take a shower, our motivation is that we want to be clean. Every single tiny thing has motivation behind it, even when the stakes aren't as high as in a fantasy novel where the whole kingdom is at stake if this goal doesn't get achieved. If we don't have a reason to do what we do, we simply won't do it. And the same goes for your characters. If your character doesn't have a goal, why would they act towards a goal that doesn't exist? If your character isn't motivated to save the kingdom, then why would they act like they are completely enamored and their whole life has been taken over by this motivation and by this goal to save the kingdom? It doesn't make sense. If we don't have a reason to do what we do, it's not gonna happen. You can argue that yes, sometimes we do things even when we're not motivated, like on Monday morning and people have to go to work. I doubt that there are a lot of people who feel motivated then, but deep down we do still have that motivation to go, that is, we need money. So even if I don't want to, deep down I'm still motivated to go to work. But even if that is a motivation that is overshadowed by, I really don't want to go, I really don't want to do this, deep down we still have that motivation. If your character does not have that, there is no story to tell. Our motivations are incredibly personal, and this includes our characters. So when we have a motivation that is especially personal, which a motivation always ties back to the character personally somehow, there is some kind of personal motivation, some kind of personal reason as to why they want this thing to happen, whether it be personal peace of mind, whether it be to help someone that they care about. Somehow there's always a personal reason to it, and that, as a reader, then gives us something to root for. We know why this goal is important to our characters. Without a goal and without a motivation, we don't have anything to root for as the reader. If the character just wants to go back to the way that things were because there is no motivation, so why are we doing what we're doing, then there's no happy ending to root for. There's no goal that we are looking forward to. There is no suspense of, will this big motivation be achieved despite the huge climax that's currently happening and despite what of a pickle the characters are in. If your character is meant to escape from prison, let's say that they committed a crime, and they are acting towards escaping, but we as a reader know that they would much rather just stay where they are, we're not going to be rooting for them to escape. Instead, we're going to be sitting there like, why are you doing what you're doing? That doesn't make sense. And so there both won't be a story for a character, and there won't be one for the reader to enjoy either. On top of that, as said before, every single thing that we as humans do has a motivation behind it. And even when your characters aren't human, let's say that they are elves, fae, trolls, cats. Yes, I'm referring to warrior cats. I love those books. At the end of the day, you still write about the human experience. Even if your character is an inanimate object, at the end of the day, you are trying to relate your story to humans. That means that your character has to, at least for the most part, share their wants and needs with one that a human would have. That means that your character needs a motivation. We can only relate to things that we know or that we experience. It is what connects us to the characters and the story in general. While their environment will influence them, let's say that they are living in a completely different world compared to ours, at the end of the day, the character's needs should match that of a human being. That includes peace, good health, love, care, regular food on the table, the opportunity to take care of themselves physically, like washing, bathing, and getting their hair cut, and overall a state of well-being. If a character has none of those needs, there is nothing for us to relate to. And the people, even in real life, that we like the most are usually people that we can heavily relate to. Meaning that to at least some extent, we need that in the book as well. If there is a situation where you're like, I don't really like this character, I really can't relate to them, it is because they aren't relatable to you personally. That is what makes a character not likable and causes you to not be able to connect with them. Our motivation is a core part of our lives as human beings. We want to see that reflected in material that we are able to relate to. It is an expectation that we have when we open a book, that at least to some degree we'll be able to relate to the character, or at least be able to say, yes, if I had that need, if I had that motivation, I would act in that way too. We care because the character cares. And that's a very important one to remember when you are writing. Your character's motivation affects their thought processes as well as their actions throughout the course of the story. Let's take the example of the character who is running from the police. They don't want to be caught. Their motivation is to not be caught and keep their freedom. They are going to act in a way that will prevent them, hopefully, from being caught by the police. Now, if your character didn't have that motivation, or let's say that they saw a police car down the road on their way to the store. If they didn't have the motivation of not being caught, they might just walk right past the police car. If their motivation is, I don't want to be caught, I want to keep my freedom, they might decide to instead take a U-turn and take a different route to the store. Some people have been known to change what they look. Men may grow out their facial hair, women may cut their hair off or dye it. I suppose men may do that as well. But if you don't have the motivation to keep your freedom, to not be caught, then why would you do those actions? You wouldn't, because there wouldn't be any reason to. Let's say that your character is stuck in a cave and their motivation is, I want to get out. They will walk towards where they think the exit is instead of where they think the cave will lead deeper and further away from the exit. It affects their thought process, it affects their actions, it affects their reasoning. Because we will act in favor of our motivation and in favor of what it is that we want. We will never take an action unless we have no other choice that brings us further away from our goal and goes right against our motivation and reasonings. This also goes for your characters, because if they did, they would be acting against logic. So how do you find your character's motivation? There isn't, in my opinion, a very clear process that you can go through in order to find your character's motivation. Every story and therefore every character is different, and you can put one character in 5 different situations and each time their motivation will change. That means that it's very individualized. However, there are things that you can look at that will give you hints as to what their motivation could be. Of course, just writing the story is vital. And getting to just know them throughout the course of the story. You're not going to be able to find your character's motivation without doing that. But there are other things that you can look at as well while you are planning, or things that you can keep an eye out for as you are writing. The first thing you can look out for is their wants, needs, values, and morals. We as people never go against our wants, needs, values, and morals unless we don't have another choice. These 4 things we create in order to help support ourselves as we go through life. That means that our motivation, which again is usually in favor of ourselves, or at least partly in favor of ourselves, maybe it's also to help support somebody else who we care about. I just lost my train of thought completely. I just completely lost my train of thought. Fuck. Oh, why, brain? Why? I'm gonna blame it on the heat. I'm just gonna blame it on the heat and move on. Our instincts are always based off of what we need and want in life. Our instincts are meant to protect us physically, mentally, emotionally, for some people spiritually, depending on what you believe. And our instincts are based off of our wants, needs, morals, and values. That means that our instincts, and thus our motivation, will always be led by these 4 things. Means we will make decisions based off of these 4 things and determine what we need in life to advance, be happy, and have our needs met by looking at all of these 4 things, meaning that it will heavily influence your character's motivation. You will rarely see a character have a motivation that goes directly against their needs, or that goes directly against their morals. You can also look at the consequences of what will happen to the character personally if a certain goal is not achieved. I'm going to use the main character of the story here just as an example. Let's say that their goal, their motivation, is not achieved. Again, using the example of the guy running from the police. His motivation failed. He was caught by the police. That means that he will now be locked up for a very, very long time, which is a personal tragedy to the main character. Let's say that their motivation is to save the kingdom. It doesn't happen. The consequence of that is huge for that character, in the sense that their homeland and the place that they love and want to protect is gonna be gone. Our motivation isn't always based on our ideal outcome, but rather the consequences of what will happen if our motivation and our goal are not reached. If our motivation doesn't work, negative consequences are much, much more potent when it comes to bringing people into action rather than a positive outcome, because that we can usually explain away as just a dream for the future or our ideal world, which isn't necessarily something we will always aspire to act to or actually make steps towards happening. But when it comes to consequences that we want to avoid, it evokes fear, it evokes anxiety, stress, and our brain is much more likely to act on those things. The bigger the consequences, and I mean negatively, for your character if a certain outcome is not reached, the more likely it is that it is connected directly to your character's motivation. If a certain outcome doesn't have negative effects for the main character, doesn't leave a mark, doesn't evoke trauma, doesn't shake up their entire world or destroys their entire life, or just doesn't have consequences that are like, okay, that sucks, I'm just gonna move on with my day, then it's most likely not a good motivation. There's most likely going to be no real motivation behind it. Certainly not enough to inspire a whole book. The higher the stakes for the character personally, the most likely it is to be directly tied to your character's motivation. The wants and needs of your character's surroundings and environment will also heavily influence them. Let's say that your character's motivation, let's say that they have just started a second job, and their motivation is to make more money, to be more financially stable. Now let's add another player in there, their grandmother. She just had a large operation, she's struggling to pay medical bills. Their motivation might then change from personal financial well-being and stability to wanting to help their grandmother pay off their medical bills, and that's why they may have taken that second job. Humans, or most of them at least, are highly capable of empathy. We want to help other people as much as we can. While we always have to put ourselves first, because that's just the way that we have to survive, we can't survive in the way that we need to if we only think about other people first. When it is possible for us to think about ourselves and other people, most likely the brain will compromise to find a solution for both. How can I take care of myself and this other person or other situation around me without compromising my own well-being? That is, of course, unless you're writing about someone like a narcissist or a sociopath or a psychopath, then that doesn't apply. But in the case that your character isn't a psychopath, which I assume most aren't, then that would be a factor that comes into play. And lastly, you'll want to look at their background. We as people are shaped by our background and the things that we have experienced. From when we are a baby, we make new memories, new experiences, and that shapes our view of the world, of ourselves, as well as what we want for our present and future. If we grow up in a household that is not financially stable, the parents are struggling to pay the bills every single month, and we as a child see that, we may decide to go into a field that pays quite well. Our motivation then would be to make sure that we don't fall into that financial rabbit hole that our parents did. Now let's say that another character is taking that same course, going to the same school, studying the same thing, but they come from a wealthy family. Their motivation might be to do something in life with their passion, rather than to make sure that they don't fall into a financial rabbit hole. Another example, let's say that your character is an artist, and their father always encouraged them, in scenario A, to become an artist, saying like, yes, you can absolutely become an artist, I believe that you can make money off of this, I believe in you. The character's motivation might be tied to achieving their dream, achieving a certain amount of fame. Their motivation might be to have their name out there, to sell a lot of pieces of their artwork. Now let's say scenario B, the father wasn't supportive and always said, you're delusional if you think that you can make money off of this. Just use it as a hobby, but like for the rest, just like quit it because this is dumb and this is ridiculous. Their motivation might be much more closely tied to proving their father wrong. They might be sitting in their studio every day creating artwork after artwork after artwork with the intention, with the motivation of, I'm going to prove him wrong. I'm going to prove to him that I can do this. Their motivation might be to get an apology or just hear them say, you know what, you were right and I was wrong. If the main character had someone near them that was murdered, they might become a police officer later on to get that person justice or to make sure that the same tragedy doesn't happen to another family. If that hadn't happened, that person might have become a cook or started working in sales instead, and might have had an entirely different motivation for that, maybe just because they like cooking and they want to do something with that passion. Your character's background is essential to figuring out their motivation. We are who we are as people because our past shaped us. We can't exist as the people that we are without the things that we experienced. Just look at examples in your own life. Think of a big event in your life and try to think of how it changed you and how it shaped you and maybe how it still affects you today. What did you learn from that experience? That's going to change why you do some of the things that you do. Everything up until where you are currently has brought you to where you are currently. There's a good chance that if your life hadn't gone the way that it did, you would not be sitting where you are right now. Your life might have looked completely different, and the same goes for your characters. At the end of the day, you're gonna have to just write the story and figure this out as you go. Sometimes, again, if it is your main protagonist or your narrator, it might be more easy to figure out what their motivations are. For side characters or like those really tiny characters, again, each and every single one has a motivation. It can be harder to figure out. And if you don't figure it out in the first draft or the second draft, don't panic. It's normal. Sometimes it's just really hard to figure out and you don't know enough yet about the story or the other players in your story in order to figure it out. You'll get there, but you do have to continue trying and kind of put the puzzle pieces together as you go. Now, I hope that this video gave you some insight into how to find your character's motivation. I hope that it will help you along your writing journey. I will be uploading another video next week. If you have any suggestions as to what you would like to see, leave them in the comments down below. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.